kind of verbose to have to repeat writing create element over and over and over again. There's a couple ways to do this. So first of all, a bunch of people that write React don't even know what create element is. The reason being is that they never have to write it, because we're going to get to writing JSX in maybe like an hour. Yeah, so they don't ever have to write create element. JSX transpiles to create element calls. But I do know some crazy people that have chosen not to write JSX. And it is possible to write huge apps without using any JSX. So I'm going to show you just a couple tricks of how to do that a little bit easier. So you can say const ce equals react.createElement. And then now I can replace all these create elements. So I'm just going to do find react.createElement and replace that with ce. And we'll just say replace all, and I got to do that again, create element. And it gets a little bit easier to, or it's a little less dense, right? You don't need all those react.create elements every single time. There's also a package called create factory that helps as well. And there's also React DOM helpers, which I'm not going to show you how to do today because it's kind of the old way of doing it. And once we get to JSX, it's not helpful anyway. But you can do things like div and h1, right? So you can actually call them by the name of the function, then you get rid of this. Oops. What happened there? Right, and it looks something like that, right? Again, getting less and less dense, but you have to go get some helper libraries to do that, and we're not going to do that today. Okay. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and talk about props and attributes. So far, not super useful, right? Because we're just rendering out my second component a bunch of times, not entirely exciting. So let's go make this a little bit more interesting. We can actually pass properties from my first component into my title. So let's try doing that real quick. So we're going to pass like we can call it the title. And we're going to put some of our favorite TV shows in here. So let's put like Game of Thrones. It's a good one. Stranger Things. It's a good TV show.
Rick and Morty.
Rick and Morty. It's a good one. And Silicon Valley. Cool. So now inside of my title, the first thing that's going to be passed into it is a thing called props. And props is just going to be whatever you passed in right here. So instead of saying my component right here, I can say props.title. So now if we save this and come back over here, notice that now we have multiple different kinds of titles, which is pretty cool. So we're getting more reusable, right? More flexible. We can pass different properties into components and kind of mold them. Right now we're just changing the text, but we can do all sorts of things, right? Sometimes I could be like, show this particular theme for this widget, or I don't know. If the user's logged in, show this. If the user's logged out, show that.
Just to clarify, props is just like a syntax that most people use, or do people call the
Would you call this anything other than props? Never.
Yeah. Okay.
You would never call it anything other than props. I've never seen it called anything other than props. So it is convention. You could call it something else. Don't. So let's go take this even a step further, and we want to change the color of whatever is being passed in here. So we're going to pass something else into all of these. So one of my favorite interview questions to ask people is always, what's your favorite CSS named color? I have a couple new ones. So there's yellow-green, which is my favorite. My second favorite is green-yellow. And lime-green. And then just lime, which are also different colors. So, actually, still my favorite is Peru. You really just can't beat Peru, which is a color.
I know Papaya Whip is
Papaya
pretty
Whip's
cool.
pretty good. What else? I don't know. Like medium aquamarine, that's another really good one. So what we're going to do here is we're going to pass that color to be the color of the H1, right? So instead of being null here, we're going to pass it an object, and we're going to give it a style attribute. It's not a typical like style string that you'd put into the onto the actual DOM, right? It's actually going to be an object, which is a little bit easier to work with. So we're going to do color, and then it's going to be props.color. Right, and as long as this is called the same thing, it could be anything, right? So if I change this to be like, I don't know, the Canadian way, or British way, or both. But anyway, so now if we save that and come back over here, notice that we have various shades of green and Peru. If you did not know, that is the color of Peru. Okay, any questions so far?
So for the style, you could pass in a string, but that's just cumbersome. That's why we don't do that.
I don't think it actually works.
Oh, okay.
So really what's happening underneath the hood is this is actually interacting with the JavaScript API for DOM elements, and this is the way you actually interact with the style API with just like the DOM API. Cool.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do any authors ever avoid using props and instead, pass individual arguments to the constructor for a little bit better self-documenting components, or because my title could accept a color and a title as arguments, and that would be a little bit more obvious than just a property bag coming in.
The answer to that question is no, you do have to do it this way because React is actually hooking into those, and it'll know when to re-render based on what you passed into it. Now you can get around that by, which I'll show you later today, with Flow, because then Flow will start warning you. So typing your React components actually helps a ton. There's also something called prop types, which again we will also talk about those. And Flow is going to be a static type checker, so it's going to tell you that at compile time, whereas prop types is going to tell you at runtimes like, hey, this was missing. So it is a problem, but there's tooling to get around it. That's a good question.
Terry's asking, what about attributes?
Like what kind of attributes?
I think it's the same thing. Props and attributes are synonymous.
Yeah, and like in this particular case for React, we call them props, but they are like attributes as well.
Yeah, attributes in HTML.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is really it for React at its most basic level, right? Just passing props down into other components. We're going to get here to state momentarily.
One other question.
Yeah, sure.
Just for a little bit further clarification on that second argument, which is null. Those are HTML attributes.
So for this particular one, right, for the H1s and the divs, this is actually going to be the attributes that are going to be put onto the DOM, right? But for something like my title, this isn't actually something that gets rendered directly to the DOM. Like there's not a my title tag, right? So this is what's passed into the component here as props.
Okay. So is ID, my first component, is ID recognized as a special property that gets tagged on to HTML or?
It's React naively passes that just to the DOM, right?
Okay.
So for example, if this was React Native, it would be a totally different set of attributes, right? Does that make sense? Cool. So again, if you have something like Flow, Flow will check that for you to make sure it's like, hey, you tried to pass, IDD, and that's not a thing, so that's a failure, right? But we're not using anything like that yet. So don't mess it up. That's the big key here, is to just not mess up anything. Good question. Other questions? Yeah.
Just about the collar, removal of collars.
Mm-hmm.
Is that just coming from, where is that coming from?
These particular colors.
Yeah.
These are all
Native
native
CSS.
colors, right?
Oh,
So I could
okay.
totally call this,
Yeah, okay.
right? And that would totally work. Cool. So this is it for writing React without JSX. We're going to start getting a little bit more complicated, and so we're going to start adopting some tooling to kind of help us along here.